Okay, so for this lesson, we are going to be able to find lengths of segments in the coordinate plane when we get finished, and that's going to be by using the distance formula. We're also going to include the midpoint formula in this lesson. Please make sure you're using a pencil when you write down your notes on your note sheet. We do have a few new vocabulary terms that you should be familiar with. The first one is midpoint. The midpoint of a segment is the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments, okay? Remember, the word congruent just means the exact same length. So to give you an example of what this might look like, I can draw you a segment that has two endpoints, and then imagine it was a piece of licorice and you were bending it so that the two ends came together. You would find the midpoint of that piece of licorice by bending it and folding it in half. So if this is the midpoint M, that means we have a point, let's just call this C and this one L, that this length here is going to be the same as this length here, and that's how we mark congruent segments, is with that little tick mark on the segment itself. So this tick mark indicates congruent to this tick mark. Okay, so that means that CM is congruent to ML, and if that's the case, then that means that M is the midpoint. So just to conclude the word midpoint, it's really the halfway point on a segment. We're going to move on and discuss the segment bisector. A segment bisector is a point, line, line segment, or plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint. So if we were to consider the picture that I have drawn here, this segment right here has a segment bisector. Right now it's point M, but what if I connected it to another point, let's just say P? Well, then the ray MP is going to be a bisector of that segment CL because it's touching it at its midpoint here. Okay, so just to review, a segment bisector is either a point, it could be the midpoint, it could be a ray like I've drawn, it could be a line segment, or a plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint, and we represent the midpoint usually with letter M. So it's cutting that segment in half. A midpoint or a segment bisector bisects, and that just means to cut in half. So the word bisects means cut in half. And that's an important one to remember. We're going to be using that for the rest of the semester. So moving on to the actual midpoint formula, and the midpoint formula asks us to average the x values of 2 points and average the y values of 2 points. So let's remember that the word average means to add together two numbers and divide by 2. Okay, so we're averaging the x values, and then we're also going to take the average of the y values, and there's a specific formula that I'd like you to write in the box. We're going to put x1, the first x value, and add it to the second x value, or the second x value given in the 2 points we're given, divided by 2. And we also have to come up with the y value, the average of the y values, so y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So if you take a look at what they give us here, point A has an x and a y, and point B would have an x and a y value on a coordinate plane. And to find the midpoint M, we have to do the formula for x's, and we have to do the formula for y. So M is going to have an x value and a y value, just like points A and B have an x value and a y value. And when we want to find the length of a line, I would like you to use the distance formula. So this is for finding the length of a line segment, actually. So anytime the question on one of your problems asks you to find the length, you always want to refer to the distance formula. The distance formula says that any segment, and let's just call it AB, is going to be the square root, okay, so we're going to need to use our calculators for this most likely, is going to be the square root of the difference of the two x values squared added to the difference of the y values squared. Okay, remember difference means to subtract. So if we have point A and it has an x and a y value, and we have point B and it has an x and a y value, then we can plug those values into the distance formula to find the length of the line. Alright, we're going to go ahead and do example number 1, and I would like you to read the directions. Let's get used to reading the directions because there's so much involved in each problem that we come across. In the diagram, so the diagram is here for us, line L, notice that's a lowercase l, that's indicating the name of that line that B is on. It bisects the segment AC, and remember this is called a segment because it just has the bar over top of it. It doesn't have arrows at the end. So this is a segment AC, and line B bisects the segment at point B. Well, how can we tell that it's bisected? If you take a look at the picture, at the diagram, we see those tick marks, and remember that tick mark means that it's the same length as this one over here. So if AB is 8, okay, and how do I know that it's 8? Well, it tells me my steps, my directions there. If it is 8 inches long from B over to A, and we know that these two parts are congruent because B is the midpoint. I already told us that it's the midpoint because it's been bisected by line L. Bisect means to cut in half. Okay, so that means then I have two congruent segments, and if AB is 8, then BC is also 8, and the question is asking us to find AC. Well, A is the endpoint of the long line, and C is the endpoint of the line segment as well. So we have 8 and we have 8. Okay, so 8 plus 8, that means that AC is 16 inches. I'd like you to do the on your own questions right here, and just remember that line L is going to bisect the segment. So again, bisect means that to cut in half. So the tick marks that we see are showing that those segments are congruent. And be careful, some of these could be tricky. Make sure that you're reading the information carefully when you're doing each one of those. If you have questions about the midpoints, midpoint rule, or finding the length of segments, make sure that you ask those questions in class. And here's space on your note sheet to write the questions that you want to ask. Alright, we're on the back side of the paper for example number 2, and it asks us to use the midpoint formula as well as the distance formula. So for part A, we're given that the endpoints of AB are 3, 2, and 6, 7. So if you look at the diagram, here's point B, here's point A. It says find the coordinates of the midpoint M. So notice what they're asking us to find is the halfway point. It would be a lot easier if this line was, perpendicular to the x-axis or the other way, but that's not the case. It's on a diagonal here, so we have to find the diagonal. But if you think about this, this is really just the hypotenuse of a right triangle, isn't it? So we would be able to use the Pythagorean theorem, and the Pythagorean theorem is definitely tied to the distance formula. So we'll get to that in just a moment, but let's go ahead and use the midpoint formula to find the midpoint values x and y for point M. So again, remember from the other side of the paper, we're going to average the two x values and find a value for x, and then we're going to also find the average of the two y values and find a value for y. So midpoint M is going to have an x value and a y value, and we need to do both. So according to the information that we've been given, we want to average the x's. So we're going to say 6 plus 3. 6 is x here, 3 is x here, and we're going to divide by 2. And if we see that's 9 divided by 2, so you could leave it as 9 halves if you'd like to, or divide it, and you would end up with 4.5 for the x value. And then I also have to do this for the y values of each point. 7 is the y value for B, 2 is the y value for A, so 2 plus 7, again divide by 2, 2 plus 7 is 9, divide by 2, 4.5. So we need to have both an x value and a y value. If you take a look at the diagram itself, this would be a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5, and if we go 4.5, that's exactly where we find point M. And again, if you look at your graph, this does come out exactly where we thought it would at 4.5, both on the x value, or sorry, on the x-axis and on the y-axis. Our directions for example 2 ask us to use the midpoint formula, which we did, and now we need to go ahead and use the distance formula. Remember, anytime we're asked for length, that automatically indicates that we want to use the distance formula. So from the front of the page, remember that we said that the length of a segment is as long as the square root of the difference of the two x values, and then we're going to square that. And then we also have to say y squared minus, not y squared, y2 minus y1, and that is squared. All of this is under the square root symbol. So if you can't remember that the numbers that are kind of lowered here, that just indicates it's the second point. This is the first point. Remember, there are 2 points that we're dealing with on our graph. And it really doesn't matter which point you pick as the first point or the second point, because when we square things, everything comes out positive anyways. So let's go ahead and fill in the things that we need to fill in. And just for the sake of recognizing which point is which, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to pick point A as my first point. So A is going to be my first point, and so anytime you see a 1, I'm going to put the value from point A, and this is going to be my second point, and so anytime I see a 2, I'm going to put the number from point B. So let's go ahead and get started. Looks like I have a 6 as my x value for B, and I'm going to subtract my x value for A. I'm going to square that. Then I'm going to take the y value from my second point, and that's 7. I'm going to subtract my y value from my first point, that's 2. And now I can just work out everything underneath according to the order of operations. So I can say the square root, and remember 6 minus 3 is just 3, but I have to square it. And 7 minus 2 is 5, but I have to square that also. Now when I square things, it's 3 times 3. Remember, it's not 3 times 2. This right here is going to end up being 9, and then I'm going to add that to 25. And so my answer ends up being the square root of 34. There's not really a decent square root of 34 number or value that I can leave, so I'm just going to leave it as the square root of 34, and that can be my final answer. Now if you have a calculator with you and you actually want to take the square root of 34, I think it comes out to something like 5.8. And that is an approximate figure, and so we can write our little symbol that means approximately, that little squiggly in front. But like I said, you can just leave it as a square root of 34. Remember, the length that we just found was the length of AB. Okay, so we just found this length right here. It's approximately 5.8. Maybe it's inches, maybe it's centimeters, but we know that it's approximately 5.8. That's the length of the hypotenuse of that right triangle that I mentioned at the beginning when I started marking this picture up so severely. You're going to be doing the on your own problems right here. It's asking you to find the midpoint, and so based on the 2 points that you're given, make sure that you add the two x values together and find the average, and then also do the same thing for the y values, okay? Don't stop once you've gotten the the first part, which is the x values, all right? So go ahead and plug in what you know. This is an x value, this is a y value, this is an x value, this is a y value. All right, those are not negative numbers. I just underlined the letter, so I can take that off. Okay, so after you're done with the midpoint, I want you to move on to working with distance formula, and you do need to show your work here. So on this, you're going to say, what is the first point that I'm going to use? I'm going to subtract the second point. Remember, you can pick whichever one you'd like. So if you want point A to be your first point, then this is going to be x1, and this is going to be y1, x1, y1. And if this is your second point here, then this is going to be x2, and this is going to be y2. That's a suggestion. You don't have to follow it, but it gives you a sense of how to get started on your work. Again, just make sure that if you have any questions about distance formula or midpoint, you write those questions down. Please just leave your answer in square root form. That's fine. You can just leave it, unless, of course, it comes out to a whole number answer. Then you can put it in that form. But just leaving it under the square root is just fine with me. Make sure you use a pencil as you're completing this, this note sheet. Thank you.